Passive and active voice are used all the time. For example, that last sentence was in the past tense, and I didn't even plan that. It just came out. So today I'm going to be explaining the difference between passive and active voice in English, because they're not really the same. Saying the book was read instead of I read the book sound the same, but they are used in completely different situations. In this video, I'm going to tell you why it is paramount to learn the passive voice, to understand passive and active voice in English, and how knowing the difference between them can give your voice a whole new tone. Passive voice in particular is very powerful, and I'm so excited to teach it to you today. Passive voice and active voice. What does it really mean? It all has to do with the subject and the action that is being performed in any given sentence. In the active voice, the subject performs the action. This is probably what you're most familiar with. But in the passive voice, it's a bit different. In passive voice, the action happens to the subject.
The universe was created in a third of that time.
In the sentence that I just played from the movie Steve Jobs, the sentence was, the universe was created in a third of that time. We don't know who did the creating of the universe, right? We don't know who performed that action. But it's not important because the subject here is the universe, and the action was created happened to the subject, the universe. And that, my friends, is the passive voice. Here's another example in the passive voice. We're gonna go through many examples in this video, so don't worry. But with this one, I want you to just try to notice what is receiving the action.
This hut was built with straw and earth.
Now let's look at the active voice really quickly with this sentence. The woman throws the baseball. In the sentence, the subject is the woman. She is performing the action throwing the object, the baseball. Now let's flip it to the passive voice. The baseball is thrown by the woman. Now the baseball is the subject. It's not performing any action. Instead, it's receiving the action of being thrown. A general rule for passive and active voice is that active voice is more commonly used because the passive voice can sound a bit awkward at times and it's more difficult to kind of formulate together, especially if you're a non-native. There are though multiple situations where it's good to use either passive voice or active voice. For example, Tom painted an entire house could also be in the passive voice where you say, the entire house was painted by Tom. It means the same thing. Sure, with either sentence, you're emphasizing Tom or the house being painted by using either passive or active voice. But in this case, it's not really a big deal. What's the focus of the sentence? What comes first? What's the subject? Active voice is generally preferred by English teachers when you're learning a language because it's usually easier and it is the more common. But there are some situations where passive voice is perfect for you to use, and it might even be weird if you use active voice in these situations. And we're gonna get to that later in this video, which I'm really excited about. But right now, let's focus specifically on the grammar of the passive voice, how you yourself can formulate your own sentences in the passive voice. There are 3 steps to doing this. First, locate the object in the active voice sentence and turn it into the subject of the passive sentence. Second, use the verb to be as the same tense of the main verb in the active sentence. Third, use the past participle of the main verb of the active sentence. Let's go over this a little more using an example. Here's a sentence in the active voice. A woman baked a cake. Now let's try to turn it into the passive voice using our steps. The first thing that we do is locate the object and change it into the subject of our passive sentence. In this sentence, the object is the cake. Once we've located that object, we just move it to the very beginning of our passive sentence. And we have the start of our sentence, guys, a cake. Then we keep the same verb tense as before, but use the past participle of the main verb of that active sentence. Therefore, we say a cake was baked by the woman. Now, try it for yourself with this sentence that is in the active voice. The wedding planner is making the reservations. What does this sentence look like in the past tense? You don't need to get it right, just try to think. Now that you've had a chance to think about it, let's break it down together. The object of this sentence is the reservations. So in the passive voice, this sentence would look like, the reservations are being made by the wedding planner. That is the passive voice. By the way, if you're liking this video so far, don't forget to give it a thumbs up to let me know. Let's review all of this with a quiz, you guys, with 2 rounds. The first round, I'm going to be playing a movie clip, and I want you guys to notice the sentence that is bolded and tell me if that sentence is in the passive voice or the active voice, and we'll go from there.
On September 17, 1920, the American Professional Football Association was formed.
So, was that sentence in the passive voice or the active voice? It's in the passive voice. The big giveaway here is that you're not being told who formed that American Football Association. You're just told that it was formed, not by who. The one who performed the action isn't even there, so it's in the passive voice. Let's watch another video example. For round 2, tell me if the sentence that is bolded is in the passive or active voice.
I've invented my own.
You invented an entire language?
So, was the sentence in the passive voice or the active voice? You tell me. It's in the active voice. Why? Because the subject is performing the action here. When looking at these sentences and trying to identify it all, just focus on what's receiving the action or what's performing the action. Then you'll be able to spot it like that. Now my follow-up question. How do we change that last sentence into the passive voice? So what you want to do here is take out the you and add an entire language to the front of the sentence. Again, 'cause it's receiving the action. Then we just add the past participle and we get an entire language was invented. We don't need the you anywhere else in the sentence just because it's not really relevant, it's not the focus anymore because it's now in the passive voice. So it's no longer the focus of the sentence. The language is the focus. Let's watch one more example.
The word meme was coined in 1976 by a British evolutionary biologist named Richard Dawkins.
Was the bolded part in this clip in the passive voice or the active voice? It was in the passive voice, yes. Now follow-up question, why? Because the subject of the sentence is what is receiving the action that's being performed. The word meme was created. By who? A biologist. But that's not what's too important in this sentence. What's important is meme being created. A lot of the time when you use the passive voice in English, you actually end up taking out the subject that performed the action just because it's no longer relevant and it can kind of make the sentence seem awkward. That's not the only use of the passive tense though, to just take out the subject that performs the action. There's other uses too, and we will get to that very soon. So let's listen to a few more examples of the passive voice just so you can get it in your head better.
Some believe that the first mutant was born thousands of years ago.
Here we have, some believe that the first mutant was born thousands of years ago. The first mutant is the subject that is being acted upon. It's receiving that action of being born. But who birthed the first mutant? We don't know because it honestly doesn't matter. Let's look at another one.
Last fall, a Colorado woman was found 9 miles from her home.
We have a girl who was found outside of her home. But who performed the action of finding her? It's not in there because it's not relevant. It does not matter. What matters was the girl that was found, not who found her. This is how powerful the passive voice can be, and I love it. Learning how to use passive and active voice in real life can be very difficult, I am not gonna lie. Especially since you're probably so used to using the active voice. I get it. I found that one of the best ways to really focus on and practice the passive voice though, get it in your head, is by seeing it used in real life. This is where FluentU comes in. FluentU teaches you English through real world content. So that what you're learning is actually used in real life. Like you can actually see it being used. So you're not learning like textbook English, so you'll sound like a textbook. You're learning real world English, so you'll sound like a actual native speaker. It basically takes bite-sized chunks of videos and turns it into your own English lesson. with transcripts and quizzes and review games and all this great stuff to help keep what you're learning in your head. I suggest going on to FluentU and practicing the grammar structure of both passive and active voice by watching lots of different clips and see if you can notice the passive voice. And when you do find a sentence that's in the passive voice, notice what situation it's being used in. You can press on the link to get a free trial of FluentU for free. As you can see, the passive voice is actually used quite often in everyday English, which is why it's so important for you guys to learn it and use it so you can sound native. Some people, however, put off learning the passive voice because they think it's not very commonly used. And I get where you're coming from, but I'm gonna show you how often it actually is used. Here are the circumstances where you do use the passive voice. Be sure to write them down because I'll be quizzing you about this afterwards. First, when you don't want to place blame. You can use the passive voice to discuss something that happened without placing the blame on any person, without explicitly saying who did it. For example, if your team at work didn't meet the project deadline, instead of saying, "We didn't meet the deadline for the project," you could just say, "The deadline for the project was not met." Usually when you do this, it softens the blow a bit, right? You're not talking about yourselves, just the project, because you're not really placing the blame on anyone. But if someone was more angry or wanted to assign the blame to somebody else, then they might use the active voice. This person did not meet the project deadline. It makes it more harsh, I guess, in this certain situation. Second, you use the passive voice when you have no choice. Sometimes you don't know who performed an action, and you can't use the active voice if you don't know who performed the action. Am I right? For example, if there was a bicycle that was left on the side of the road and you don't know who left it there, you can say, "The bicycle was left on the side of the road." We don't know who left the bicycle on the side of the road, so we can't make a sentence in the active voice. It has to be passive here, because we don't know who performed the action. You can also use the passive voice to try to figure out the subject of a sentence. For example, you could say something like this: "The cake was eaten when I got home." Do you know who did it? You're trying to figure out who performed the action, which is why you're using the passive voice. The third situation that you use the passive voice is when you're writing in an academic or scientific context. Researchers sometimes prefer the passive voice. They don't want to include themselves in their research or conclusions. The passive voice makes the writing sound more humble and puts a focus on the research instead of the researcher. It's the difference between "we discovered interesting results" and "interesting results were discovered." Passive voice makes the writing just sound so much more humble and more academic because you're focusing on the research and not yourself. Doesn't that second sentence just sound so much more scientific than the first? That's the power of the passive voice. The fourth time you can use the passive voice is when you want to shake up your creative writing or make your writing more enjoyable to read. When used in moderation, the passive voice is able to prevent you from using the same sentence structure over and over and over again and make your writing not very good. The passive voice will help make your creative writing more interesting to the reader. If you enjoy writing and you're writing in the same sentence structure for like most of your sentences, it's not gonna sound very good. Passive voice is a lot better at just helping make your creative writing more, well, creative, I guess. Now, let's review everything that I talked about with a quick quiz. I told you guys to prepare for this. Question 1. Let's say that you made a mistake in a class project and you have to tell your teacher about it. Are you gonna use the passive voice or the active voice to do so? You can say something like, "It got messed up," to your teacher to tell them about the project failure without placing the blame. That's passive voice. So, I personally would use the passive voice in this situation to avoid blame or blaming anybody else. Question 2. Watch this video clip and tell me why you think this sentence is in the passive voice.
I was made fun of because of the way I talked, because of where I came from.
The reason this sentence is in the passive voice is that the people who performed the action of making fun of this girl, we don't know who they are. It's not the focus of the sentence. The focus is that she was made fun of, not the people who did it. That's why this sentence is in the passive voice. Question number 3. Watch this clip and tell me why this sentence is in the active voice.
Her dad invented YouTube.
The reason this sentence is in the active voice is because the subject performing the action of inventing YouTube is important in this sentence. It's the focus. That's the information that they want to get across to you in this sentence. Not that YouTube was invented, but that this person's dad was the one who invented YouTube. That's the focus. Are you guys starting to see how powerful it can be to use passive and active voice in English? Now, you're probably wondering when we use the active voice in English. I know we went over the passive voice a lot in this video because it's less known. So how do we use active voice? When do we use it? Generally, we do use the active voice more in English. It's easier, we don't really need to think a lot about it, and most of the time we just want to emphasize the subject of who's performing the action. So, besides the exceptions that I just went over about when to use passive voice, active voice is great, and you should use it. See, passive voice and active voice are supposed to be used together, right? So that the speech in your writing isn't boring. I would suggest that you guys try out passive voice a little bit more after watching this video just so that you can practice and get more familiar with it. Then you'll be able to use both active and passive voice pretty easily. And passive voice definitely makes you sound more advanced and like you know what you're talking about a little more. So that's another plus. Now, for your homework today, you guys, I want you to come up with one sentence that is in the passive voice and one sentence that is in the active voice and comment below. I'll be checking in the comments to see if you're correct or not. If you want to review everything that I went over in this video, I have a free PDF that I made for you in the description below. Now, I have part 2 of today's lesson for you right over there to check out next. I go over how to learn English with a Netflix movie. And we all love Netflix, right? Your task is to go over there and see how many sentences you notice that are in the passive voice. I will see you guys over there.